Hey everybody, what's up? You may not know me, but my name is David Ariev, and hopefully you'll be seeing a lot more of me in the near future for School of Motion. So today we're going to be creating an infinity mirror room look using Cinema 4D and Octane Render. Now what I mean by that is just taking an object and putting it inside a fully reflective box. There's a little more to it than that, but depending on the geometry of that box, you get some very intricate and crazy looks that you could use for concert visuals or your sweet Instagram renders, whatever you want. Anyway, let's check it out. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen photos like this before, but there are these things out there called infinity mirror boxes, basically just a box of mirrors. It's like the simplest thing ever, but they're really cool for museum installations and for getting these really pretty hallway looks of infinite lights, and they just kind of look magical and otherworldly. But just by the nature of having every surface in the room being a mirror reflection, you get this extreme depth and feel that you're in this massive sea of the lights or whatever is inside the box. Now, recently I was asked to recreate this look for a client, and this is what I came up with. This one's actually flying through the center of a chandelier, so we get that added element of objects passing close to the lens, and we get that interesting depth and motion blur. And this is actually one of the more simple boxes that I made, but it doesn't really take much geometry at all to really sell this look. Now, this is actually the same shot, but with a fisheye lens, and we're going to get into the universal camera and how to tweak that out to get these really insane, trippy looking visuals. And again, this is that same scene, but we're just doing a camera orbit. And you can see the mirror box geometry kind of cutting in and including the chandelier at certain points, which I think is kind of a cool added detail. And I also animated back to a much wider focal length here. So we're seeing this almost fractal triangular pattern emerging. And then I just had the camera zoom back in so that we could get a perfect loop here. Next, I tried something that wasn't a chandelier and took an animation from a couple years before, borrowed it from a deadmau5 project file, and copied it in here. It's just some really simple animating lines. There's nothing crazy going on. I'm just animating the scale of these guys, but just wanted to see if I could get more of a sci-fi and tech look out of this. I like the perspective here, almost looking down this tunnel is kind of cool. Now here's where things started to get a little bit more wacky, and I'll break this down more when we get to it, but essentially I'm just animating the focal length of the new fisheye lens in the universal camera system all the way out to its extreme, where we get this super distorted look, almost like it's shot from a 360 camera. And for the techie lines here, I used Merc Vilson's plugin Topoformer, as well as his other plugin Respline, to just grab the splines from the geometry. And the only other thing to note here is that I do have motion blur on so that when it gets out to this wide focal length, it's not quite as harsh. We see a little bit of these objects that are passing quickly by the lens, streaking out a bit, and I've animated the aperture so that we get these out of focus bokeh that pass close to the lens. And here's a separate still from that last shot that I just thought looked cool on its own. And here I want to give a shout out to my buddy Tom, who goes by I Am Cyclo on Instagram. He got all excited and inspired by the renders that I was posting, so he decided to go and start making his own, and he sent me what he was making, and he started using these buckyballs, which are basically these spheres formed by hexagons as the mirror surface, and he was getting some other really cool looks. So that gave me the idea to go back and push a little bit further and try out a bunch of other crazy looks too. And so this one is with the buckyball, and this one here is actually just using a standard sphere, and I'll show you this in a bit. And then I was just getting all sorts of different looks with the various sphere types like icosahedron, and then also using Merc Vilson's plugin Topoformer again to create the geometry of the room to get these really psychedelic looks that remind me of mandalas. All right, so jumping into C4D here, we've got our chandelier with a couple of backlights that are just giving a bit of color variation and highlight to this object. If we zoom in to the candle here, I've got some fingerprint texture on here. Let's select this material and go to the node editor. And if I right click and solo this, you can see that we've got that fingerprint texture in the roughness, but overall this is an extremely simple material. I've got some triplanar mapping going on, which you can learn about in other tutorials that I've already done before. But in general, we're not even going to be close enough to see this, so it really doesn't matter. Basically, the chandelier is just made up of a little bit of gold metal, some silver metal, and then mostly glass with some black body emission for the bulbs. Now you're about to find out that this is an extremely simple technique. So to create a mirror box, what do? We make a cube. Let's scale it up until we're inside the cube. And then let's just create a glossy material. Let's throw that on the cube. Take our color down to black. And let's take our index all the way up to 8. And there you go. You can see we're already starting to get a bunch of reflections. Now, one issue here is we're seeing these backlights duplicated a million times, even though we've got the opacity set to 0. Same thing if we turn off the camera and shadow visibility or the general visibility, none of that affects anything. But luckily, Octane version 4 and above has light linking. So what we can do is we can throw an Octane object tag here on the cube, and then we can set our light pass mask to enable. And currently I've got these light pass IDs set to 2. So if we jump back to our cube here and untick 2, we should see these go away, except for in the actual chandelier. Now this might look a little more interesting if we weren't at this odd angle compared to the cube. So let's reset this here and reset some of these transform values so that we're squared up with the chandelier. And let's just back this up. Now we're perfectly symmetrical with the chandelier and we can see more of this receding mirror box look. Now let me quickly adjust my light rig because it's no longer working for us. So I'll just group these and scoot them a bit back and to the side here and rotate them a little bit more towards camera. Okay, so overall I'd say this is looking pretty boring. We might get a bit more out of it if we actually move this up and do more of an Instagram type format. So I'm just gonna go for square for the time being and do 1920 by 1920. And then I'll kind of tweak this a bit. Actually, let's do 1080 by 1080. So now we've got more of a sense of the overall perspective, but there's definitely something missing. And this is the importance of looking at actual reference. When I was looking at the references, I noticed that you could see the actual edges of the mirrors, and that gave it more of a practical or tangible feel. So I thought maybe it would help to actually introduce bevels. So if we just grab the bevel deformer here and hold down Shift to drop it under our cube, we can then go in here and change the offset to maybe something like 1. And now you can start to see that we're actually getting a little bevel here. Let's change it a bit bigger. And let's up the subdivisions to something like 3 so that we're getting a bit of a beefier bevel here. You can start to see something happening. We're starting to catch these little edge highlights. So that's going to look more interesting. Now the next issue I feel is that this is all falling off too sharply. And the center chandelier is really, really bright, whereas everything else is super dark. So if we jump back to our metal material, let's call this our mirror. We can take this glossy material all the way down to an index of 1. And now we're going to get a perfect mirror reflection. But the issue is now that there's 0 fall off whatsoever. And to me, it all feels a little bit overwhelming in the amount of detail. And at this point, I thought, okay, well, this is too bright and this is too dark. Is there a way we can split the difference? And obviously the answer is a mix material. So let's just drop in a mix material and we'll create a second copy of this mirror material here. And we'll set this one to 1. So again, we've got this one at index 8 and this one at index 1. And in our mix material, we can just drop these together and it'll default to a 0.5 mix here. And then we can just drop this back onto our cube. And now I think we have the best of both worlds. So this is what I stuck with as the material for our mirror box for the rest of the project. One other quick thing to mention is I'm in path tracing. If you're in direct lighting, this won't work. So you need to be in path tracing. And again, as usual, I have my GI clamp set to 1. So that's one thing you'll have to change. So the rest of this tutorial is now going to be experimenting with different forms of this mirror box, how we can make this more interesting, and different focal lengths, and breaking down the camera animations I did. So let's move a bit closer to this chandelier and maybe get a wider lens. Right now we're at a 50, so let's bring it out to like a 35. If you hold down 2 and right click, you can dynamically zoom. So actually let's go to like a 24. And now you can see we're getting a different pattern that's pretty interesting. If I actually scale down this mirror box here, you can see that these objects are all going to get closer and bigger. One problem is at some point you start to clip the box, but this definitely creates a much more dramatic look. Now I've lost my 2 lights, so I'll bring that a little bit closer so that's not clipping out of the box. And another thing to note here is that I've got a LUT going on. Without it, we've got this kind of greenish and desaturated cast. So with this on, I like the orange and kind of teal look a lot better. And this LUT currently that I've got going on is Vision 6 from the Osiris pack. And another thing to note that's pretty exciting for me is in our bloom power here, if we crank this up, there's a new feature in Octane 2019 that actually has a cutoff so that we can prevent the scene from getting overly bloomed out. So this will now just affect the highlights or wherever you want to cut this off, basically. So you can see now we've got these lights glowing pretty intensely without affecting the rest of the scene. Now maybe I want to do some kind of happy medium and bring this down a little bit, and maybe not that much bloom, but somewhere in there could be kind of cool. Maybe bring in a little bit of bloom, maybe something like that. Now if we rotate this cube 45 degrees, we get a totally different look that's cool in its own right. And if we widen out our lens, you can see we're going to get some really interesting fractal patterns going on, where we're seeing multiple vanishing points happening. One other thing we could do is we could actually thicken up this bevel even more. So if we took the offset up to something like 3, we would have beefier edges. Though actually, let's keep it a little bit more subtle. Let's go back to like something like 1.5. Okay, so at this point you can fly all around your object. You can put whatever you want into this box and explore. You can get some pretty cool patterns. Say we come over here. So that's not a bad look. But I wanted to see if I could push this further. So what I did was I turned off the bevel, and I'm going to pause this render here. Now I'm going to do the simplest thing I can possibly do with modeling. I'm going to go here and expand this a bit and go to my polygons. And I'm going to make this editable and select all, then do an inner extrude all the way down to something like this, and then extrude. Let's go back into our camera here, and let's turn our bevel back on, and then unpause our render. And now you should be able to see we're getting a much more unique look where we're seeing this almost scaffolding-like structure emerge just from these bevels that are catching the edge highlights. So coming back to our 0 position with our camera, this is the look we're getting. Now maybe we could increase the scale of our box a little bit here to give ourselves a bit more room. And then we could back the camera off a bit. So it gets kind of interesting when we're actually sitting inside this little pocket here. And all things considered, this is rendering pretty quick. And now if we widen out even more, and maybe increase the exposure. So I think that's a pretty unique look right there. Now maybe we drop a null object into the center of our scene and put our camera in the null so that we can rotate a little bit once I give myself some more room here. We could tilt upwards a bit, and then we could also pan down with our camera. And now we're getting this pretty insane looking triangle, which is composed of these 3 vanishing points. So if I jump back to this clip, this is actually the exact same scene. And I'm going to jump into that scene just to prove it to you. And same thing with this initial shot too, exact same scene. There's literally nothing else going on except I'm flying down through the middle of this chandelier. So let's go take a look at those real quick. All right, here we go. So I've just got this camera inside a null object at the center of the scene, and the null is rotating over the course of the entire timeline, 1,000 frames by 720 degrees, so that we get a perfect loop once we hit the end here. And you can see my mirror box is slightly different from what I showed you guys. So it looks like when I made this cube editable, what I actually did was selected all the geometry, did an inner extrude here, did an extrude outwards, did another inner extrude inwards, and then did a final extrusion inwards. So that's all the geometry that I used to create that mirror box. But you can get a lot more creative and complex with it by modeling out all sorts of other different kinds of forms. And maybe the forms aren't symmetrical. You'll get lots of really weird and crazy looks just by playing with the form of the mirror box. Now, the other thing going on here is I do have this chandelier slowly rotating because I thought it was interesting to counter the movement of our camera with the movement of the chandelier. Makes it feel like it's going a little bit faster paced than the rest of the scene, which I thought was kind of cool. And then the other thing that's happening here is I'm animating my focal length all the way out to something like a 10 mil lens. So if you look here, you can see my keyframes. And actually, this is something I wanted to fix in the original. I felt like this needed to be dragged out a little bit more because it felt like it kind of clunked down a bit to me, but that's just me being picky. So if we look here, super simple, just animating that focal length so the camera zooms out to a super wide lens. And that's when, if we pause here at a frame like this, we're going to get this interesting triangle. And you can see that bit of extra geo that I modeled in there is creating a much more detailed looking scaffold. This has got a very fractal vibe to it. And one last thing I want to point out is I do have a little bit of shallow depth of field going on. So if we twirl open our depth of field here, you'll see the aperture is at 0.026, and I've got these anamorphic bokeh going on with the aspect ratio of 2 and the aperture edge of 3, kind of my go-to for the bokeh, as you guys probably already know. But then by the time that the camera animates out here, there's still that same amount of shallow depth of field, but on wider lenses, you aren't going to notice it nearly as much. So if I store this render buffer and then take out the depth of field entirely, we'll see what happens. It's super subtle out here. You can see it in this foreground element, and it is affecting the background a little bit, but you probably wouldn't notice it at this focal length. I love how these corner points create these little starbursts. Feels like very cool scaffolding going on and all these layers of reflection that we're getting. Okay, and if we look here at this other shot, it's extremely simple. I've just removed some of the middle elements of this chandelier so that we can actually fly through it. That's literally all that's going on. And we're looking down on the chandelier versus before when we were down here. So super simple. And again, I've got the camera rotating in one direction and the chandelier rotating in the opposite direction, which I think adds a bit of extra interest to the shot. And then when we're flying through these elements, the motion blur helps smooth things out. So that's just set to 0.02 here. Now, the next thing that I started to play with is actually the universal camera, which is new in Octane 2019, I believe. So if we jump over here to camera type, we can go from thin lens down to universal. Now, at first, there's no difference in the look, but we should be able to notice a bunch of new fields here. So this is pretty exciting stuff. There's a fisheye field. Now, if we play with this, nothing happens. And same thing for panoramic, because these are actually camera types that we can change here in a second. But if we come down here to distortion, we get a bunch of different new options. So there's spherical distortion, so you can see what happens there. So I'll let that refine for a second. And maybe we widen out this lens to really emphasize it. Now we're getting some really cool curvature going on. Now I'll take this back down and maybe bring our lens back to a less distorted focal length. And here we've also got barrel distortion. Let's see how far we can crank this. Can only go up to 1. But that's kind of a cool look in and of itself. Let's compare this to the spherical distortion to see what the difference is. So let's go compare store render buffer, bring this back to 0, and then take our spherical distortion up. Okay, so it is a very different look. And then if we combine the two, we can get even more of an extreme look, which really distorts out the center as well as the corners. And then finally, we've got this barrel corners, which kind of brings in the corners even further. And let's bring this all the way up to 1. So that's some pretty cool curvature. The other thing to note is that with barrel distortion, we can actually go negative. So we can go to -1, and then if we reset this and this here, we'll see that this is kind of like optics compensation in After Effects, where the image is stretching more towards the camera. So that's a cool look too that could maybe be used to emphasize like an action scene. If the edges of the frame are kind of rushing towards you a bit more, it almost feels like zoom blur. Now, one other really cool thing here is we've got this distortion texture. So say I just load let's load a C40 Octane image texture in here and jump in. And let's just grab something like the Super Grebe texture of Beeples. And so this is really abstract, but we're actually using this texture to distort the camera. And obviously this isn't like an appropriate use of this texture, or maybe something that you should do, but it could be used for some really weird, trippy effects. And as you move the camera, it's hard to see, but we do get totally different elements coming through here. So it's almost like we're shooting through this crazy glass texture or something like that. All right, so now this next thing under aberration doesn't seem to work unless you've got some f-stop going on. So let's just increase this f-stop until we get a bit of bokeh in our image, which this already looks pretty cool. So let's try playing with this spherical aberration. Let's crank it up to 1. And let's compare what this looks like to not having it on. So compare store render buffer and take this back down to 0. And so it looks like it's kind of squishing and almost refocusing our lens. So it would be pretty cool to see what this looks like in a normal scene. That's not for this tutorial, but I'll definitely investigate it later, and you should too. And if we take this to -1, looks like things get even crazier. So for now, I don't know what's happening scientifically here. It really looks like the bokeh have changed, like they've got much thinner opacity towards the center, which that might actually be a property of the aperture edge. So let's take that back down. Yeah, that's just the aperture edge. So forget what I said there. I actually do want that on. And then the other thing here is if we had our aperture aspect ratio back at 2, this does a much weirder thing in universal camera mode. It doesn't really stretch out the bokeh, it just kind of compresses the whole frame, much like you would in an actual anamorphic lens, I guess. So that's a bit weird. And I'll take this back to 0. Now we've got this thing called coma. Now this is really cool. Again, I have no clue how to explain what's going on here other than we're getting these comet streaks. And I'm definitely going to mess with this a lot more later because this opens up a whole lot of new possibilities for some abstract images. Let's see what happens if we crank this all the way to 1. Really cool and weird. Maybe let's take our aperture down so it's not so extreme. I have to say that is pretty cool. Just going to save that one out for later. This is actually maybe even nicer here because of the symmetry. All right, and here's something else interesting. If we take this spherical distortion all the way down and the barrel distortion all the way down and then the barrel corners all the way down, which apparently can also go negative, we can have something like this. And then taking out the coma, this negative distortion is also really cool. All right, so let's bring the aperture back up a little bit so we can check out these other effects here. And maybe let's focus here on our chandelier. Let's store our render buffer. And then let's see what astigmatism does. So this one's really cool in that it is stretching out the bokeh, but it's doing it in more of a radial fashion. So it's all stretching out from this central angle. So again, that feels a little bit more like a zoom blur to me. And let's not forget to set it to a negative angle so that we get this horizontal radial stretching. Let's set that back to 0. And then let's see what this field curvature does. So if anything, this just feels like it's enhancing the bokeh. I don't really know exactly how to define what's happening here. Let's see what happens if we go to -1. And now it feels like it's reducing the bokeh to some degree. But weirdly, we've got some of these areas in the very edge of frame that are in focus. So to me, it seems like this is more of a radial blur, where now we're sharp on the edges and soft in the middle. Whereas before, if we crank this up to 1 and we compare again, you can see the center is changing much less than these edges here. The further out we go, the more blurry we get. So I'm pretty sure this is a form of a radial blur, which is another really cool option to have. And these will add a lot of really unique lensing kind of looks to our projects from now on. So this is one of the reasons I really love Otoy, is they put in a lot of these unique creative features that maybe we didn't even know we needed, but now we can't live without. Okay, so next I'm going to switch this from thin lens to orthographic. So now we can have perfectly flattened infinite lenses, which is really cool in its own right. And let's take down this aperture to 0 so we can see this properly. So now it's really like we're looking from an orthogonal viewpoint. And if I kill the keyframes on my camera so that I can rotate around here, you'll see some really interesting, wacky results here, especially in this mirror box. I don't know if this is the best way to test this. So this is more of like an isometric, or actually more correctly, parallel lens type perspective, which just means that it's an infinitely long focal length, basically. Now, before, say we were to take this to our thin lens, if we were to go to our Cinema 4D camera and select parallel camera, this would actually be the same thing. So it looks like Octane already does respect this parallel camera mode, but now we can just kind of control that from within the universal camera and setting it to orthographic. Now there's this orthographic tick box, which I don't totally understand, other than that now when I zoom in and out, it's not affected by that. Whereas before, this was actually linked to our focal length. So I think personally I prefer not taking this. Now, other than orthographic, we also have things like equirectangular, so we can do some super crazy 360 looks. And this kind of option was available before in the panoramic camera. So that's basically what's going on here. Spherical, cylindrical, there's a bunch of different projection types. Cube maps. So let's go back to universal. That's all kind of the same thing, though we also have cube map option here. But this can be a fun one to play with. This is how you would export for VR basically, though, in a 2:1 aspect ratio. So something like 2000 by 1000. So this is more what you'd expect for VR, or rather 360 uploads to YouTube, that kind of thing. And with that, you'd probably want to crank it to at least 4000 by 2000 or even 8000 by 4000, because you really need a ton more resolution when you're doing those full 360 stills or animations. But I'm going to jump back here to what we had before, as well as our aspect ratio. All right, let's go back to the universal camera type here. And now we're going to investigate, instead of thin lens, we're going to try out the fisheye lens. Now these sliders from the distortion tab and the aberration tab aren't going to do anything anymore. The only control we've got at this point is under the fisheye field. So by default, we're getting a really cool look. And if we go more towards the 90-degree realm here, we get to much more of a normal looking lens. And the further we take it this way, the more we're going to get this extremely wide fisheye look. There's also this option for hard vignette, which crops the whole image down to a circle. And that's not really something that I would want, so I'm going to untick that. We've also got circular versus full frame fisheye types, which, as far as I can tell, full frame just kind of punches in a bit more. And then we have different projections. So I was going with the stereographic, but there's also equidistant, which is also super unique in its own right. And we definitely get a lot of distortion here towards the edges. Then we've got equisolid, which again brings us back to a circle, but it feels a lot more uniform across the projection, which is pretty cool. And hard vignette isn't doing a whole lot. It's cropping a little bit here, but not very much. Now, this one, if we come all the way out, we get a perfect circle. And if we push in, we actually lose that crop at some point, which is good. So you can see if we crank it all the way to a 360 fisheye, equidistant does a lot more distorting, whereas equisolid really evens things out a lot more. But then if we go to stereographic, we lose everything entirely, because this is the one that really kind of scales everything back and widens out the focal length until we see more and more and more, until it finally gets all kind of sucked down to a single point. So if we went 359, we're getting some very abstract and cool looks here. And then also remember, we can take the aperture all the way down. And at this point, I have no clue what I'm even seeing, but it's pretty cool. And finally, we have this orthographic mode, which kind of bulges out the center maybe more than equisolid, for instance, or equidistant. So you can see the center here with equidistant is a bit smaller. And then when we go to orthographic, we get much more of a true to scale representation of the center. And weirdly here, it doesn't look like we can lose that cropping. Even when we come into a shallower angle, we still have that circular crop. And here, I would assume that orthographic means that it's some kind of flat projection, like a parallel camera. But when we actually orbit around, it does still feel very much like it's in perspective. So I'm not the most technical person to say like what's exactly going on here. I just know that if I mess around with these different modes, I can get some pretty atypical results. Now I'm going to revert this scene. And if I start my render going and jump back to fisheye, this is the look that I had for another one of my shots. I'll play the shot for you here. It's really just default fisheye, circular, and 240 angle. So super simple. It's that same scene that flies through the chandelier, and it looks pretty impressive and like something I've never seen before. But at the same time, the techniques to get here were kind of stupid easy. All right, so next we're actually going to be changing around the geometry for the mirror box. And I wanted to flag this for you because I'm going to be using some Merc Filson plugins. If you don't know Merc Filson, he creates some really cool tutorials, and even better, he creates some very powerful plugins for Cinema 4D. So if we scroll down here, there's things like Polygreeble and another one that's really popular called Tripogen. But the main one here that we're going to be focusing on, if we scroll down, is called Topoformer. So we'll want Topoformer, and a little bit later, we'll also be using this Respline plugin. Okay, so I'm just going to lose this bevel here and save it for later. And I'm going to shut off this cube because we're done with it for now. And we're going to start playing around with spheres. So let's just drop in a sphere. Let's scale it up. And now if we start our render,
And I'm probably going to change this back to our normal lens. Let's go back to a thin lens. And then let's also take our coma back down to 0. And let's drop our texture back on the sphere. And then also we want our Octane object tags so we're not getting those reflections. So you can see this isn't really working yet, but what we need is the bevel. So let's just drop that in there. And now we're getting some pretty crazy patterns. Let's take the number of sphere segments down because weirdly this works a lot better when we have fewer segments. So let's go down to, let's try 12. Could even go down to 6. And now we've got another totally unique pattern. Let's maybe boost this bevel offset so we see it a bit better. Now we can see the lines connecting here a bit more. And we could scale down the sphere a bit. And then we've lost our lights, so let's group these and bring them a little bit closer to the camera. Let's jump out here so that we can see what we're doing. This is our current mirror box. Let's bring these in. For this, I'm not sure if we actually need the lights. So let's just go with this default kind of orange look. And now we're getting that really crazy curvature and almost flower-like patterns without even needing a fisheye lens. Not to say we can't check out what a fisheye lens would look like. So that's pretty cool too. Again, we're getting some stuff that looks very much like a mandala. I love it when we can get some really intricate designs without almost any effort whatsoever. That's my favorite. Just let the computer do all the work. So maybe we drop the exposure a little bit. Okay, let's go back to our thin lens here. And remember, we could rotate around the sphere. So maybe we're not facing exactly the same direction, and see what happens when we do that. You could even create an animation that's just rotating this sphere around. So you can kind of imagine what that would look like. Let's undo. Now, what happens if we change it from a standard to, say, a tetrahedron? And also, I think one thing that's happening is we've still got our barrel distortion on here, which is contributing to that curvature. So let's go back to 0 on all these. This is more like what I was expecting to see. And then I think that we could reset the transforms on this camera so that things are a bit more symmetrical. There we go. This one's okay because this is actually what's controlling our distance to the chandelier here. And now we could widen out the lens and get something super crazy like that. Let's see what our fisheye lens looks like. Very cool. Come all the way out here. I'm really digging this one. We're getting such fractal-like patterns that it's reminding me of that Vectron tutorial I did a few months ago. I'm also liking that we've got a slight shallow depth of field going on so that the stuff on the edges doesn't necessarily draw our attention, gets a little bit out of focus, and we can focus more on this central pattern. Now just imagine if this geometry were animated in some way to kind of unfold. Not that I personally know how to do that, but I'm sure some Houdini artists do, and we get some really cool kaleidoscopic shifting patterns. All right, now let's try out a hexahedron. And again, let's go back to our thin lens so we can see what this really looks like up close. And maybe let's zoom our focal length in a bit. Very cool. Let's try octahedron. So there's octahedron with a fisheye. And keep in mind, we can always add more segments. So every time we add more segments, we get totally different and unexpected patterns. Same thing if we increase our radius. So I love that this makes you look like some kind of mathematical super genius when in reality you have no idea what you're doing. And let's not forget our friend icosahedron. We'll jump back to a thin lens. Maybe zoom back in a bit and maybe give it more segments. So now we get a really pointy and cool look. And there's kind of a diminishing return, like if we were to do 24, say 24 or 32, the detail actually just starts to be way too much. So this doesn't really work. Also keep in mind that if you rotate by 45-degree increments, you can get some other really interesting looks. Now there's one other object that we could play with that's really cool. If we just grab a platonic and do the same thing, scale it up, give it our texture and octane tag, and then put the bevel on it, And let's get rid of the sphere and give ourselves some room. We're going to get some other cool looks too. Now, under our type, we could change it from Icosa to Bucky. And now we've got a buckyball, which is made up of hexagons. Now, I think I was getting better looks before when I scaled this up a little bit. And now once this refines, we can see that we've got this infinite tunnel going down each one of these hexagons, which I thought was really cool. And one thing that could beef this up even more is if we come in here and give our bevel a bit more offset. So maybe we really want to emphasize these lines in this one. So if we play with some of these other modes, we get back to more of a standard mirror box with hexa, octa, dodeca. Dodeca is pretty dang cool. And Icosa has its own look that's slightly different from the icosahedron with a sphere. Tetra is also really cool. Now this is just a simple prism, just a pyramid, and that's giving us some very cool looking forms as well. I also like having these stronger bevels in this case because it creates these streaks and more detail that almost look like strands of wire connecting these various chandeliers together. And also don't forget that we could up the segments to get something even crazier. But I was actually liking it a bit more simple here. I think I'm liking this one enough to save it out. Okay, finally, let's take a look at what happens when we start using Merk Vilson's plugin. So I'm just going to drop a sphere in here and scale it all the way up until we're inside of it. And then let's take our bevel in here and our texture and Octane object tag, drop that on there, and let's just turn off this platonic for now. And we can probably take the distance of our bevel down a bit. So let's just drop our segments down here and give ourselves some space. So I'm going to drop down to plugins, Topoformer. And if I just drop this on the same level of hierarchy here, I get all these options. So let's just start with Ashthorpe. And let's zoom out to see what's even happening. So let's pause this render. So without the plugin, our sphere is looking like this. And with the plugin, we're getting some very interesting, almost stained glass looking geometry. Now, if we take this delta down, it's not going to distort the sphere. So this could be something that you don't want where it starts to get asymmetrical. So up to you. You can get different patterns either way. And we can also take down the number of iterations. So maybe we just start with one iteration, which gives us this very cool look here. Let's jump back in. That's pretty cool, but I think it's a bit too detailed. So let's take our number of segments down even further. Let's try 6. And now we're getting this cool star pattern. And also, if it's too bright, you can either take down the exposure or we can just scale up this sphere. And this will kind of separate out all the elements. Let's take this down a little bit here so that we can see our whole image. And now we've actually got a perfect star, which is kind of cool. And each point has this fractal recursive look going on. And here's what I get by just widening out the lens a bit and increasing the coma to 1. I think the fun thing here is that nobody would guess how this was done by just looking at this image alone. Like even me just a week ago coming to this fresh would say, okay, maybe this was made with particles. Like I wouldn't know how this was made at all. And we get some pretty cool looks too with this negative coma. And remember, we can increase our iterations here to 3 with our Topoformer to get something even more complicated looking. Maybe let's zoom in. The Beeple mode gets something much more angular. Chudder's mode is pretty cool. Let's take it down all the way on the delta. And here you can see the thing I was saying before about Houdini animating these geometry features. Maybe we don't even need that because check this out. Look what happens if we animate this epsilon. And if we drop this open, you'll see that Merk was nice enough to put in a David Ariev mode. So let's take a look at that. Of course, it doesn't work. It's just totally broken. This one's just the janky mode. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think we just need more segments. So let's jump this up to 12 or higher. Let's go 24. All right, we're starting to see something. Now, the other thing we want to do is take this delta all the way down so it's not reducing the polygons. You can see here, delta level of polygon reduction. And now maybe we've got too many. Let's take this down to 12. There we go. Actually, this does need to be up at like 24. There we go. Now we're getting a cool result. Also, the bevel is too much. So let's take this back down. That's more like it. And let's scale this up so it's less overwhelming. And we might also want to take this epsilon all the way down so that we get less of the collapse of these polygroups here. We can change the seed on a lot of these to get different results. In general, this one I think is too complex for this technique. It's just a little bit visually chaotic. But I just wanted to show you, since it's nice that he gave me my own noise type. Let's see what else we got. Polygon sandwich. This one's super crazy. Got my buddy Steve Teeps up in here. We can definitely take the number of segments way down on this. This one seems to make triforces, which I'm definitely into. Steve got the good one. Oh, and you can even rotate these guys. So I'm really curious about this. I'm going to do an animation and get back to you guys, but here we can go from this. Let's store our render buffer, and we can animate the epsilon up until we get these triangles. Actually, here's what I'm going to do. This is Rich Nosworthy's noise type, and he's got some really cool controls on this one. So the epsilon here will scale these central polygons into triangles. So that's one transformation that can occur. And then here with the delta, we're actually rotating them. So we can kind of make this thing transform in some pretty crazy ways. So I'll get back to you guys once that's done. All right, so sadly, I can already tell that this is going to be a fail. As we play back the animation, you can see it's super jumpy. And I think that's just because the polygons are not stable as these elements scale outwards. So it's not going to work for the mirror surface, but this is actually a good lesson in setting your max samples pretty low when you render out a test render. So I've just got them set to 200, and this is enough to get a pretty solid idea of how the animation is going to look. Then when you're happy and you don't see any mistakes, you can crank it up to the full samples, which here I was using either 2000 or 4000 to get out the final looks. Now, I did have one other look that I was curious to try out with the animation. So it was this one here, and if I render this, so I've got the fisheye on, and we're just starting out very close to this corner, so we're getting all this weird detail. And then as we come forward, I can see all these things changing, and overlaps happening with the mirror box, and this is the one where we fly again through that chandelier. So we're going to get some cool patterns. I'm going to see what this looks like. But again, I'll render it low sample at first so that we can check it out and make sure that it's going to look good. The other thing that I'd like to point out that's really speeding me up is that I've got my net render going. So here you can see we've got a slave with an additional 3 GPUs, and I actually have one other PC up and running. So let me pull up our Octane Render network preferences here, and I'll just tick this on, and it'll authenticate the slave, and then we'll go back here, and now we've got 5 GPUs in addition to the 4 on this computer. And actually one of those is offline. Usually I have 4 in my second computer, but I had to pull that card because everything was unstable. So GPU issues and PC building issues, they're pretty common. And these cards do eventually burn out, but usually they're under warranty for a couple of years. So often you can send them back in and get them replaced. So to download that with the latest version, you actually go to, instead of Octane Render Standalone, there's a separate tab now for the slave node. So all you do is you make sure it's matched to the same version that you're currently using. So right now I'm using, if you see up here, Octane 2019 1.4, and I've got the enterprise version. So if you come over here, you see, okay, Octane 2019 1.4, we download this. And again, I would do this on my other computer, download. And then you would just install this, and where that would go would be to your C drive, program files, OTOY, and you find your latest version here, and you say install daemon, and I just hit enter a bunch of times because I'm fine with all the defaults, and then you run install daemon, and once you've done that, your render node will be up and running. So now that this is up, this machine is actually ready to run as a node as well, though obviously it can't do this and run as a node at the same time, so you'd have to kill the render, and if you had a render on another PC, this could run as a node. So I can already see this is going to be a much more cool looking animation. So what I'll do is stop it and then go back to our settings, and I'm going to crank this back up to 2000, and I'll render this guy out and get back to you.
All right, so I like certain aspects of the shot and other aspects I don't like as much. Definitely the first half I think is better, but when the camera passes through the chandelier, the fisheye lens and distorted perspective causes those shapes to move super quickly, and I'm not liking that quite as much. Also, those shapes overtake the whole screen, and because of that slight shallow depth of field, we've got this kind of blurry mass that's going on that's obscuring the rest of the picture. So again, not perfect, but kind of a cool experiment anyway. And if I wanted to, I could re-render without the shallow depth of field, but that takes a long time and I'd rather move on. All right, so finally I'm going to break down this last shot for you guys that you see here, and it's pretty simple overall. So let's just start with a cube, and again, we're going to use Topoformer. So let's go to plugins and then Topoformer, and let's drop this underneath the cube. And I'm just going to go straight to the Beeple mode here, and we're going to need more segments on the cube. Let's try 15 by 15 by 15. And there we're getting some cool detail. I think I want more iterations, so there's some even smaller details in there. And then let's scooch this over a bit. There's this really cool option in the Generate tab, which allows us to create a MoExtrude rig. So we just hit Create. And there magically we've got all these greeble extrusions going on. Now, I don't necessarily want the polygons to scale down. So you'd think you could just untick scale here, but it's actually linked up to the Topoformer. So let's just take scale down to 0. And there we go. We've got a standard kind of greeble cube. We could maybe jump the position out to 20 centimeters to make it even more dramatic. And then from here, we're going to use this other plugin by Merc called Respline. So there's a ton of really cool tools in here, but I'm going to jump down to this one called Motion Trim. And so we'll just put this cube into Motion Trim. And so that's going to convert all of the polygons into actual spline geometry. So maybe we need to scale up this cube. Let's go 400 by 400 by 400. And I think that's a little bit nicer looking. If we untick the Motion Trim, it's a little less crazy on the extrusion. So I could have just taken the extrusion down, but this is fine too. Now, the cool thing about Motion Trim is that you've got this trim amount. So we could bump this up so we're actually seeing less of the splines. So this is going to cut the paths. And this would actually be easier to see if I took down the number of iterations on this Topoformer for a second. So let's just take it down to 2. So this should let us actually play back a bit faster. So let's go to like an animation speed of 11. And now we've got this super easy to create procedural animation of all the splines moving. Now, unfortunately, using animation speed created some issues with Octane where the texture that's driving the color of these splines kept popping around when I was using this mode. So I'm going to take this back down to 0. And instead I went to offset here and keyframe this, which played more nicely with Octane and allowed the animation to stay a lot more stable. So I'll just change these to linear keyframes and you can see it's doing the same kind of thing. So having those limitations from 0 to 100 means that if you've got a really long animation sequence, like 1,000 frames, like I did, there's only so fast that you can drive it. So that's the one kind of downside of using offset, but there wasn't really a way around it. Now from here, if we render this, obviously we're not going to see anything. I'm going to drop in a black background here. But what we can do is we can go to C40 Octane tags and drop in an Octane object tag. And under hair, we can render this as hair. Now let's just throw in a daylight here for a second so we can actually see it. So there we go. We've got these splines rendering as hair. And for some reason, this Motion Trim is also causing Octane to constantly update. So I'm going to delete any of the animation here and take this back down to 0. And I think this allows it to be a bit more stable. So really what we want here is a black body emission texture. So let's just drop in a diffuse material and go to emission and use a black body emission. And also we want our diffuse to be down to black. And at this point we can tick off our daylight and then go back to our emission texture and maybe turn on surface brightness and take this down a little bit. And then we'll want our camera imager here on so we can get some nice post-processing and bloom. Now, we're not getting any variation in color here, so the easiest way to do that is just by going back to our black body emission texture here. What we can do is we can just drag in an image texture, and then let's jump in here and add some kind of colorful texture. I could actually go with this render that I did for our second tutorial upcoming here on distortions. Let's just use that since it's got some neat looking colors. And then we'll just want to take our power down. And then with our hair here, let's take the thickness to 0.1 and 0.1. And then now we can actually boost the black body emission a little bit. So I prefer those thinner looking hairs. So really that's the whole technique. We can also, if you want, change the projection type from UV mapping to cubic, which could help. Here we'll have to scale it up a lot. So this creates maybe more consistent color versus the UV map, which is a bit more random. They both act in different ways, so it's whatever you prefer. Cool, so after seeing that previous setup, none of this should be a mystery anymore. It's that same technique that I just showed you, but that's sitting in the larger context of this mirror box. And this mirror box is just that very simple one based on the cube that we made in the very beginning of this tutorial. The only other thing to add here is that because we're doing this rotation and we've got our fisheye lens on If we go to universal, you can see there's the fisheye. And if I go to show track here and look at this curve, you'll see that I'm animating from a super wide fisheye down to our more standard lens. So that's literally all that's happening here. We're at this extreme wide angle, almost 360 lens, and then we're animating down, which makes it feel like it's all unwrapping to see the inner contents of all this madness. The other parameter I'm animating here is the f-stop, so that here we get a bit of shallow depth of field, and that makes these objects that get close to the lens, which are just, again, these splines, have bokeh. And as far as the bokeh goes, I'm using a hexagonal bokeh. So if we twirl open this depth of field, you'll see that the bokeh side count is set to 6, which gives us this hexagonal look. Maybe we can find a better frame that's more indicative. There we go. So now it's pretty clear. If this were higher, then it would get a little more round. And the other thing is, usually the default is bokeh roundness set to 1. So normally we get circular bokeh, but if we take this all the way back down to 0, then we can get these hexagonal shapes. And again, that aperture edge is set to 3 so that we get the faded center and a bit more definition on the edges. If we didn't have any aperture at all here, this is what it would look like. And you can see that we've also got motion blur on, which I've got set to 0.02, so that it's a little bit less harsh when all these objects are whipping past the camera so quickly. And finally, with this aperture here, I'm animating it down so that we don't have any shallow depth of field here. And without this, this would all be kind of out of focus. So that's the reason for animating this down. And one last time, if we bring this up, then that takes out the shallow depth of field, and we can also take off the motion blur just so you can see what this would look like without any of that stuff. So hopefully all the mysteries of this shot are revealed. It's actually surprisingly simple overall, but just using these plugins that allow me to cheat, plus the new features in Octane, make it look a lot crazier than it is.
All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope you at least picked up a few tips on the Octane Universal Camera and some other settings, and I hope that this inspires you to take these techniques and make them your own by putting your own objects, your own animations, and changing around the geometry of that mirror box to get some unique looks. All right, I'll catch you guys later. Bye!